Hi guys, thank you all for tuning in and welcome back to Sewing Lara. In this video, I will show you how to create buttonholes without a sewing machine and how to make these loops that you would need in order to close tiny buttons whenever you do not want to make a buttonhole. So let's jump right into this. We are going to use this piece of denim and a yellow denim yarn because it's so much easier to see on camera, and I already went on and created the first buttonhole so that you see what we're gonna make. So the size of the finished buttonhole should be a little bit bigger than the diameter of your button so that you will be still able to easily put the button through the hole. And now the way to measure it is to place your button in the position where you want to have it and make a mark on the top and on the bottom about 1 millimeter from the edge. And then you will simply connect these two marks, and that's the line for your hole. And the first step will be making a running stitch below this mark, above this mark, and on the left side and on the right side of the line that marks our hole. So basically around this. You want to be about 1 millimeter away, or maybe just a little bit less, from each line. So basically go quite close to the mark, but be still far enough so that later when you cut the hole open that you can't accidentally cut through your stitches. So I will pinch the needle through below the bottom mark a little bit to the left. I will leave this tail loose. It doesn't bother me. We don't have to worry about that because we can tuck it in later. I will return to the right side and go once more through this space. So it's not gonna be a sew up necessarily because I'm not gonna make a knot, but it will still secure the first stitch sufficiently. And once I have done that, I will simply start creating a running stitch. Now this fabric is quite thick, so I will make the running stitch one by one, making sure that the stitches are not too long and that they are not too far apart. Because if I would simply grab my needle in this case and thread it like so through the fabric, I'm afraid the result wouldn't be so neat, and I'd rather take my time with this and have a nice result. So I will speed this up a little bit because you already know how to create a running stitch. Now the mark for our buttonhole is framed in the running stitch, and I will start moving into the opposite direction and filling the gaps with another round of running stitch, which means I'm basically creating the faux back stitch. So now the buttonhole is framed in this faux back stitch, and I can cut the hole now open before we go on. So if you want to cut the buttonhole open, you can use either some kind of small scissors, not necessarily something like this. These are manicure scissors, but if you don't have anything else at home, they will work. You just have to be very careful, and they should be really sharp, otherwise you're gonna have hard time cutting through the hole. Ideally, you would have buttonhole scissors. So mine look like this. They are very pointy. The end is super sharp. And when I turn them to the side, you will notice how flat they are. Amazing for cutting buttonholes, also for opening stitches and for any work where you need to have a really sharp point. When I compare them with the manicure scissors, and when I hold them like so you can see them from the side, you will notice that the manicure scissors are curved and thicker. And from my experience, the point is not as sharp as the point of the buttonhole scissors. So that's why manicure scissors are not ideal. However, if you just started out and if you're not sure if you want to continue with sewing and stitching and you don't want to spend too much money, or if you're simply on a budget, they will do. But long term, I highly recommend buying buttonhole scissors. Or you can use the seam ripper, which looks like this. It looks like a little, I would say almost a fork. And the way I like doing it is I like going through the middle and then pushing slowly with the seam ripper into the direction that I want to cut. However, before I reach the end, I like pulling the longer end through the line and cutting through the fabric before I reach the end, because if you would simply push with the force, then you could accidentally cut through the last stitch, which is not what you want. And this is really tough here because denim is a thick fabric, so I'm being very careful. And I will turn my work around now and I will push through and cut. And then I'll do the same from the other side. So I will basically like go through here very closely to the stitch. And now, since this is already open, I can chop through without any incidents. You could have done this, of course, also with scissors, but I find that this tool is very useful. Works with scissors too, though. And now we have all these threads here. So what I always do is I fold the button placket in the middle and start fraying the edges out. I make sure that I don't cut through my thread because it's still attached. And then I like cutting this away. Always making sure that I don't accidentally cut through my stitches. And then I like taking something like scissors and going over this again so that I fray out as much as possible, because then I can cut it off and I will have much cleaner edge before we go on with the next step. And now that we cleaned the edges, the next step is creating blanket stitch around the opening. And we have here this tail that we didn't cut off, so I'm just gonna move it here to the side and place it on the top of the fallback stitch, and I will basically seal it in with the blanket stitch. And I like making the blanket stitch from right to the left. You can of course move in the opposite direction. Important is that you make it very dense. So each stitch is very close to the stitch that you made before that, so that the edge will be nicely sealed, that nothing will be able to fray out. So you will need quite a lot of thread. So you will definitely have to retread your needle somewhere in between, but it's definitely worth it because then the result is very neat. And as I'm moving a little bit further, I think I'm far enough from the place where the thread started. I will now chop off the tail because it doesn't have to be that long, and then I'll simply continue with the blanket stitch until I framed the entire edge of our buttonhole. One tip, the thread likes to tangle. Every now and then I like to just lay it loose like so and detangle it, detwist it before I continue, because it can be really annoying. Now I came to a point where it's pretty clear that I will be able to make maybe 1 or 2 stitches, and then I will have to retread my needle. So I'll make 2 stitches And then I will move just once through, I'd say like half of this stitch with the needle, and then I'll cut the thread off. And now I have here this tail, and I will tuck it and hide it the same way we did with the tail that we created when we started stitching. So I retreaded my needle. I will grab this tail and place it on the top of the running stitch. I will pinch the needle through right next to the last stitch, and I will go once through again and wrap the thread around it in the way you do for the blanket stitch. And now I have here these two tails, and I will hide them together. So I'll do a couple of stitches until they are safely tucked in and secured, and then I can simply chop off the end of the tails. That should be secure enough, so I'm gonna cut them off closely to the last stitch, but I made sure that I could not accidentally cut through the stitch. And I will continue creating a very dense blanket stitch around the entire edge. Now we finished this side, so we have to frame also the middle. So either you will continue creating the blanket stitch like so, and basically making multiple lines like a fan until you reach the other side. This is what I've done here. Or once you reach the edge, you will stitch back and forth from this edge to this edge. So I made the last blanket stitch, so I will pinch through. I will go through to the wrong side. I will return right here at the edge of the opposite side, and then I will stitch a couple of times back and forth. And that's how I will finish this edge. So you can see that this edge looks a little bit rounder, and this way the edge looks more square or like rectangular. That's the correct word. And then of course, once you made your last stitch, you want to do the sew up. So I do it this way. I simply stitch through somewhere here through the blanket stitch and do the sew up on one of the stitches. And then I like pulling the thread through a little bit further, and then I simply chop it off, and that way my buttonhole is finished. Now the buttonholes that we just made together are pretty chunky. That's because A, we have used denim, which is already a very thick fabric, and B, I stitched them with denim yarn. And denim yarn is much thicker than the regular cotton or polyester yarn that I would normally use, but I did that so that you could see the result much easier on camera. And another reason for them looking chunky is of course also the size of the button. The bigger the button, the bigger the hole is gonna be. Here is an example of a smaller buttonhole. So this is the size of the button that I made the hole for. I used cotton fabric and I stitched the buttonhole exactly the same way, but this time with a regular polyester yarn, and you can see that it's more subtle, and since I used the same color of the yarn as the fabric, the result looks much neater because any little imperfections are not as visible as when you would use a contrast color like we did with the yellow yarn. So that is how a smaller buttonhole on thin fabric for smaller buttons would look like. Now I have here this piece of jersey. That's a fabric that does not fray out like the denim does, so I don't have to necessarily make a blanket stitch around the buttonhole. So I'm gonna mark my buttonhole here again a little bit below each side, and then I will make a line for the buttonhole. And instead of creating first the fall back stitch and then the blanket stitch, I will simply do just the fall back stitch around the entire buttonhole. So this time I single threaded my needle because I don't want it to be too thick. And since we're not gonna do the blanket stitch, I won't have a way of how to hide the tail. So I will move here in from below the button placket. I made a little knot at the end. And I will pull the thread through to the right side, and that's where I will start stitching. So I will create basically a running stitch around first, and then I will fill the gaps so that I will create a fall back stitch, and I'll do it around the entire edge of the buttonhole. Now I am at my last stitch, so I will carefully come from below the button placket and I will do the sew up here so that it will stay hidden. So the buttonhole is framed. I will be the first to point out that it looks a little sloppy, it doesn't look perfect. To my defense, if I used a black thread, it would be a little bit more forgiving, but I used the yellow thread so that you can see it easier. And that way we can also see any imperfections, but it's okay. So I will move, I'd say like 1 millimeter from the edge, and I will pinch through with the stitch ripper. And I will simply go about towards the middle. Then I turn my work around. I will pinch through again about 1 millimeter away from the edge. And I will move towards the hole that I already opened. And here we go. And now I would be able to pull my button through. And again, I don't necessarily need to create the blanket stitch. If you feel like it would look better to you, go ahead and do that, but it's not necessary for this type of fabric. That's also something you could do if you would be working with faux leather. Instead of creating a buttonhole, you could also make a little loop that would close around the button, which is something you usually see on the back of a dress, around the back of the neckline, or inside of a waistband on a skirt. So I have here this small button, and we will pretend that this piece of jersey is the back of the dress where we want to have a little loop. So I will mark above the button with this sewing crayon and below it so that we know how big the loop is supposed to be. In the meantime, I also double threaded my needle. Again, I'm gonna use the yellow denim thread, and now we will start creating the loop. So I will go through the bottom once, and I will leave the tail a little bit bigger. Doesn't have to be super long, but a little bit bigger. This is, I would say, like probably 2.5 inches, maybe 3 inches. And then I will stitch through one more time, and while I'll be doing that, I will hold the tail here so that I can't accidentally catch it with the thread. Now I will fold the tail towards the bottom, and I will stitch through the top mark slowly so that nothing gets tangled, because the thread is now quite long. And I will create quite a loose loop, and I will make sure that both sides of the thread are the same length. And once I assured myself that they are, I can stitch through one more time and pull on the thread, and this is now secure. So this is gonna be my loop. I want the base of the loop to be a little bit thicker, so I will stitch through the bottom again. I'm still holding the tail here so that it doesn't get caught. Now I will play a little bit with this to make sure that the thread is the same length. It looks like it is, so I can stitch through the same spot again. Secure the thread, and that's gonna be the base of my loop. Now I'm gonna turn my work around. I'm gonna grab this loose tail and add it to our base of the loop. So now it's basically triple, or it's 6 threads. And now I will always pull the needle through the loop halfway through, and then I will wrap the thread around basically the same way you would do it if you would create a blanket stitch. But this time you're creating simply knots around the base of the thread. Now the thread is really long, so I always like untwisting it a little bit so that it doesn't tangle too much. And I always make sure that I hold the loose tail together with the base of the loop. And I simply continue doing this technique, this kind of blanket stitch, you can still call it blanket stitch, until I reach the other side of the loop. I'm almost done, so I will make probably 1, maybe even 2 more stitches. And now I can cut off the tail, which was the tail from the beginning of our loop. And I can do my sew up. So I will do the sew up this way. So I will pull the thread through this time from the back, but I will go through the thread. I will go once more through somewhere, make just 1 knot, so twist it only once around the base of my thread. Now I made a nice secure knot. I will pinch through the fabric just a little bit, and then I will simply pull the thread through the loop, and then I will cut it off, and that way it's secure. So I created my little loop that closes around the little button. By the way, just like with anything when it comes to hand stitching and sewing, all these things need a little time and practice. So if you just created your first buttonhole and you are not super happy with the result, don't worry, it will get better over time. Just give it time, practice, and you will improve in your own time. My buttonholes aren't perfect either, because I haven't done this in a while. I'm definitely out of practice. I'm normally always using my sewing machine. So if I were to create something with hand stitch buttonholes, I would have to practice it too. So believe in yourself. I believe in you. I'm very excited for you that you decided to learn all these skills, and just trust yourself. You will get better over time. Alright, so these were the 2 ways of how to create a buttonhole without a sewing machine, and how to create a loop for small buttons. I hope that you enjoyed watching this tutorial and that it has been helpful. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and happy sewing!